About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brew fest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55, looking for an off-grid camping spot. We drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6 miles before reaching the town. There wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small with brownish gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no, she was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting more seriously each time. My girlfriend's sister and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually we told her we had to leave, and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m. my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly, pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and towards our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp and then heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, unzipping my tent slowly and silently, I cautiously poked my head out with my gun and looked toward my truck and the fire. To my surprise, I saw a full-grown buckhorn standing there, staring at the fire's embers as if it were trying to warm up. I was relieved, but I chose to frighten it away by hitting the tent's wall. I shouted, "Get out of here," half out of the doorway, and to my surprise, the deer just turned its head and looked at me before turning back to the fire. I tried again, louder and more animated, but this time it slowly turned and began to walk towards me, which was really unsettling because deer are normally afraid of people and don't approach them at this point. It was a big buck. I hastily returned to the tent, zipped it up, and waited until the buck approached. From the fur light on the tent wall, I could see its silhouette. It stood beside my tent entrance for a good minute or two before continuing to prowl around our campsite until it eventually wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different from a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I barely slept, but it was about 5 in the morning. I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek calling out, "Hello, can you hear me? Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired, and because it was so damn creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camp down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while, but there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a whole head of brownish gray hair like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. My only regret is not going more often, but I've stayed overnight in the Yosemite Valley area twice. The first time was at a housekeeping camp, where I knew the accommodations were close to others, so I assumed the other visitors enjoying themselves, clearly with a lot of alcohol, was okay. I don't drink, and I can't understand why anyone would come to such an amazing place just to get wasted, but everyone has their reasons. I find YNP to be an amazing and enchanting place, and I feel incredibly fortunate to be within driving distance of a place that people travel to see every year. With the exception of the individuals next to me who chose to drink all night and, as is frequently the case with AL's drinks, became louder and louder until 4 a.m., I was there for mine and others came for theirs, and I accepted that. They weren't obnoxious, but they were very loud, and I didn't get any quality sleep. My plans for the next day were ruined as I was exhausted and frustrated. Then this past weekend, I stayed in camp for again. I knew the campsites were practically on top of each other, but was still hoping for the best. The group of 3 who were set up about 10 feet from our tent seemed pretty low-key. They were playing music at a low volume and just chatting. I was worn out from a long day of hiking, crawled into the tent around 8:30 and quickly fell asleep. About an hour and a half later, I woke up to hear one of the people in the trio right next to me crying hysterically, clearly drunk, loud and sobbing like they just lost a loved one or a pet. This went on for over an hour. Finally calmed down, and I fell back asleep. At about 13, I woke up again to the same person literally wrenching and puking their guts out just outside their tent loudly, and they kept vomiting all night long into the next morning. It sounded like they had alcohol poisoning and probably should have packed up and gone home or to urgent care. It was that bad. I could hear their campmates trying to get this person to drink water or eat something, but they refused and just sat outside their tent puking and dry heaving. It was awful. Continue all night. I didn't get any decent rest. My plans for a full day of hiking were now ruined, but worse, I was angry. I was tired and feeling this unpleasant frustration bubbling up inside me. It was the opposite of how I wanted to feel when visiting this beautiful, magical place that brings me peace. I got up the next morning and saw that this person had vomited all over the campsite. As we were packing to leave as soon as possible, I put off eating anything that wasn't surprising and packed up everything. This person was still making terrible noises and sticking their head out of the tent when other campers from nearby sites approached and offered them food and coffee, but they turned them down. Is the valley always full of drunk idiots, or am I just unlucky? The bright side of all this is that I found a much better place than I would have imagined before. I thought that camping with my ex-husband might help us clear the air and possibly even bring some peace between us. We didn't split up in a big fight, but there was always this tension that never really went away, so spending a few days in the woods together seemed like a good way to end things on a positive note. I won't be staying in the valley again. I drove over to Tioga Pass and checked out the Tamarack campground, and it looks amazing, huge spots and secluded. The plan was straightforward: a small campfire, a quiet area by the lake, and nothing but nature surrounding us. The first day was peaceful. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and sat by the water, watching the sun slowly set beneath the trees. It was almost too quiet, but as night fell, the air grew colder, and I felt a tight feeling in my stomach that wasn't just from the temperature. I couldn't figure out what was wrong that night because I couldn't sleep well. Every little sound seemed louder and sharper. I kept telling myself that it was just the forest and that nothing else existed. But no matter how many times I heard the rustling of leaves and the breaking of twigs, it still made me uneasy. I tried to reassure myself that something was wrong, but I couldn't get warm no matter what I did. The following morning, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air that was even thicker than before, and we didn't talk much, just went about our business as if nothing was wrong. However, the longer we stayed outside, the more I noticed small details, like the way he kept looking at me when he thought I wasn't looking, and the way he was quieter than usual, almost too quiet, as if he was waiting for something, and I couldn't tell. By the second night, the forest seemed darker, the sounds more menacing, the wind howling through the trees, and I felt like the darkness was closing in around us. I tried to ignore the growing fear by focusing on the warmth and light of the campfire, but it wasn't enough. Then I noticed things that made me feel really uneasy. His movements were odd and purposeful, and he kept pointing at the fire, but his eyes kept darting toward the tent and back to me. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. That night, I didn't sleep at all, so I lay there listening to the sounds outside and his breathing next to me. I felt trapped in darkness with no way out, and all I could think about was leaving him and whatever this was becoming. When morning finally arrived, I was tired, but I knew I had to leave. When I told him that I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to return early, he didn't argue, he just nodded, but the way he looked at me made my heart race. There was something dark in his eyes that I didn't want to face, so I kept my distance and made sure to stay close to the car as we drove back to town. The tension didn't even slightly lessen. In fact, it got worse. The road felt longer. The air inside the car felt heavier, and I could feel his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. When we finally returned, I packed up and left without saying anything, but the uneasiness lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong during that trip, something that wasn't just about us. A few days later, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small tear in my sleeping bag right where my back would have been. It wasn't big, but it looked like it had been made with something sharp. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out clear as day. I tried to think back, tried to remember when it could have happened, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more things started to make sense. The way He had been acting the looks he gave me the silence. It wasn't just the woods that had me on edge, it was him. I had gone out there thinking it was just a simple camping trip, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't prove anything, couldn't say for certain what had been on his mind, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe with him anymore. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily things could have gone wrong out there. We were alone, far from anyone who could help, and I kept wondering, what if that small tear in my sleeping bag had been meant for more than just a scare? What if it had been a warning, a reminder that no matter how things had ended between us, there was still a dark side to him that I hadn't fully seen before? That thought still keeps me up at night, because now I know there's a part of him I don't recognize, a part that I don't think I ever will, and I can't help but wonder if that part of him is waiting for the right moment to come back to finish what he might have started out there in the woods. That's a fear I can't shake, no matter how much I try to convince myself that it's over, because deep down I know it's not. I was always close to my sister-in-law Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together, so when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful night away from any town. The drive up was pleasant. The trees grew thicker as we continued into the forest, and the campsite was lovely, right by a small clear lake. The first night was quiet. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too exhausted to stay awake. But the following day I began to notice things that didn't seem right. At first, it was small things. The forest's usual rustling of leaves and animal sounds had ceased, and the sounds of the forest seemed too quiet. Along the coast, I saw fresh footprints that weren't ours, that led out of the sea and vanished into the woods. I kept my thoughts about those footprints to myself, since I didn't want to frighten Sarah, but they were too large for a regular human. Later that night, as we sat by the fire once again, I heard a low, deep sound that sounded like a growl in the distance. I tried to convince myself that it was simply my imagination playing tricks on me, but it didn't make the bad feeling go away. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a bear, far out in the woods, but Sarah didn't appear to hear it, or, if she did, she didn't respond. When we eventually went to bed, however, the sense that something wasn't right just became worse, and I couldn't sleep at all. I jumped as I heard the sound outside. The wind. I lay in my tent, peering up into the darkness, listening for anything, and then I heard it growl again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Through the trees, the break of a limb, the rustle of leaves, everything sounded louder. With my heart pounding, I sat up and listened to the slow, cautious footsteps coming from just outside the tent. It sounded like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard, so I held my breath. The footsteps circled the tent and then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy, rough breathing that sounded like something large was only a few inches away, and I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too afraid to move. The breathing continued for what seemed like an eternity before abruptly stopping and the footsteps gradually moving away. Fading into the night, I was afraid to move until the sun rose, at which point I hurried out of the tent. The ground outside was uneven, with big tracks pressed into the soil that led back into the trees from the tent. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could without speaking to each other. When we drove home, the silence was heavy, and we both knew that something had been watching us. We never talked about what had happened that night, but we never went camping again because we were too afraid of what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what might have happened is enough to keep me from ever returning. However, the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake, whatever was out there. And now every time I see a quiet lake, what may be waiting for its next opportunity to emerge just under the surface, I wonder. I've always enjoyed camping because it makes me feel free. This time, I'm planning to camp for a few days by myself, so I found a peaceful area close to a small lake in the middle of the woods. The only indication of other people is a tent set up a few hundred yards away. A man I had met before called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a little older, and he was dressed in faded camouflage. He mentioned that he was a retired commander in the military. The first day passed without any problems. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. First I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish, but as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened, so I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite calling out, but there was only silence. When I saw a small patch of disturbed dirt near his tent, I thought it might have been the site of recent excavation, but it had been hastily covered up. My heart began to race, and I felt panic rising, but I forced myself to remain composed. I found a stick and dug, and as I removed the dirt, I discovered a shallow pit with a few objects, including a knife. A worn dog tag and a notebook caught my eye. The dog tag had a name I didn't recognize, but the notebook was what really caught my attention. As I turned through the pages, I discovered notes about survival skills, old military missions, and oddly, entries about this exact camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It explained that he had been following a man who fit my description and that he was planning to kill the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too similar to mine. Because of his anxiety and fixation on this mission, he thought I was an adversary. When I heard a twig break behind me, I swung around. But no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. I had frozen the forest because it was suddenly too quiet and too near. My thoughts were racing. He could have been in the military before, but something had obviously struck him, and he determined that I was the enemy. I didn't stay to see what he had intended to do, so I dropped the notebook and hurried back to my camp. With my hands trembling, I packed up my belongings as quickly as I could, hoping he would arrive at any minute. However, he never appeared, and the only noises were the rustle of leaves in the breeze and my pounding pulse. Even today, I can't get rid of the notion that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty driving him to finish a task that never existed. Even though I left the forest that night and drove nonstop until I was miles away, I can still see him waiting by the lake when I lie awake at night, and I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target or if he'll find me again. I know I should move on from it, but there's something about the way he looked at me that makes me think this isn't over. Perhaps it's just paranoia, or perhaps it's the reality that he's still looking and that I'll never be completely safe. While my husband was away on a business trip, I made the decision to take my kids camping for the weekend. It was just the two of us, and we wanted to make some memories. We found a peaceful area at a small campground by a lake, which was only a few hours from home, so it seemed like the ideal location, safe, accessible, and yet far enough away to feel like an adventure. The first day went well. We set up the tent, roasted marshmallows, and the kids had a great time splashing around in the lake. It was nice to be away from the routine, and when nightfall arrived, I put the kids in their sleeping bags and sat by the fire to enjoy the quiet. The stars were bright, the fire crackled softly, and everything was peaceful. I started to relax. The campground was small, and from what I could see, there weren't many other people there. There were a few tents scattered about, but it felt like we had the place to ourselves. At midnight, I made the decision to call it a night because the kids were asleep and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. In the middle of the night, I woke up, got into the tent, zipped it up, and laid down next to them. At first, I was unsure of why, but then I heard a faint crunching sound that sounded like someone walking on gravel. I froze and listened carefully, and as the sound seemed to be approaching the tent, my heart began to race. I thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and controlled, so I reached out to make sure the kids were still asleep so I wouldn't wake them up and frighten them. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and I could hear someone or something breathing slowly and heavily, almost as if they were trying to remain undetected. My mind raced because I had no way to see who or what was outside without making noise, and there was no easy escape. The person outside began moving again, dragging their feet and walking around the tent, and I could see a shadow shifting through the tent fabric as they moved. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise stopped, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, waiting, but I heard nothing. I felt completely trapped, staying perfectly still and barely daring to breathe. The minutes felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep at some point because my body was sore and tense, but when I woke up, it was morning, the sun was just rising, and the kids were still sound asleep next to me. I quietly unzipped the tent and looked outside, but the ground was disturbed. It appeared as though someone had been walking in circles around our tent all night. We packed up quickly, but as soon as the kids were awake, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had been watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us, and I still can't forget that night. The thing that scares me the most is the idea that whoever was out there might still be watching, waiting for the next opportunity to get closer. Since then, I haven't taken the kids camping. I have been looking forward to this camping trip with my son for weeks. We set up our tent by a small, quiet lake surrounded by dense woods, far from other campsites. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just the two of us away from the noise and stress of everyday life. The first day went well, and we spent time cooking and fishing over the campfire. At nightfall, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of animals in the bushes. I felt content as I watched my son go to sleep in his sleeping bag at midnight. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise, a soft, steady tapping, coming from outside the tent. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be a branch moving in the wind. But the tapping became louder and seemed to come from different directions. Under the moonlight, the woodland seemed eerie as I silently unzipped the tent and ventured outdoors to attempt to locate the source of the sound. I thought it was just the wind, so I took a few steps away from the tent and saw nothing strange, just the dark shapes of the trees. However, the tapping continued all night and seemed to get closer each time. When I looked around the campsite the following morning, I saw no signs of animals or other people, just the same peaceful forest. We decided to go on a hike to try to get my mind off the strange noises, and when we returned to the campsite in the evening, everything seemed fine at first. I started preparing dinner while my son played by the water, and when I looked up, I noticed something strange on the tent. Tiny muddy handprints the size of a child's hand were smeared on the fabric. This made my spine tingle. I looked around the tent and couldn't find any footprints or other indications of anyone being there, so I tried to think it was a prank or possibly a stray animal. However, as night fell, the tapping resumed, this time louder and more urgent, as if someone was trying to get inside. I decided we would leave early the following morning, so I stayed up all night watching the tent and listening to the tapping. At dawn, I heard scurrying sounds near the tent, but I never saw anything. We packed up quickly and drove home, but once we got back, I couldn't get rid of the dread. Later, I learned that other campers in the area had also reported hearing similar noises, and even seeing strange figures in the woods. Looking back, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety that we had just barely avoided a far worse disaster, even though no one could explain what was occurring. The journey began as a straightforward father-son adventure came to an end with a terrifying reminder that the woods have more secrets than we realize. The muddy handprints and the odd tapping were never explained, but they left a lasting impression on my memory. Sometimes, I wonder what was waiting and watching in the dark just beyond the edge of our campsite.